Hi everyone. This video is specifically going to consider the inflation augmented Phillips curve. So the previous one for session 14 and 15 looked at the simple or the short run Phillips curve, and what I want to do here is just extend this by looking at the Phillips curve which is augmented to account for inflationary expectations. Before I go to the doc cam to do this, I just want to remind you what the issue was. Back when Phillips was originally looking at the relationship between unemployment rates and inflation rates, he was able to show that there is this inverse relationship between unemployment rates and the rate of wage inflation. The higher the rate of wage inflation, typically the lower the unemployment rates, while the higher the rate of unemployment, the lower the rate of wage inflation. However, that relationship that he identified was using data from the 1860s up until the 1920s, for example. And what was evident when more recent data was considered is that the data did not show such a nice, neat relationship between wage inflation and unemployment rates. This diagram here illustrates that although there are periods in time where you can identify a nice downward sloping Phillips curve, so for example, if you track 1961, 1962, 63 is a bit of an outlier, but then you've got 64, 65, 66, 67, 1968 and 1969, you can see that over the 60s there was this downward sloping Phillips curve. You can pick up another Phillips curve here if you look at 1976, 1977, 1978 and 1979. You can see one here if you look at data from the 1980s. And if you look at one, let me just see. Okay, what's evident is that it becomes a little bit more challenging to identify a Phillips curve, especially in the middle here, where all these different years are being shown. You can kind of pick up one 1970, 71, and 73. I'm not sure what happened to 72. 72 is down there. But what this seems to suggest is that over time, not only are there movements up and down the Phillips curve, but you can also think about shifts of the Phillips curve happening over time. And so what we needed to do is to try and understand how those shifts of the Phillips curve were taking place and what could be used to explain these shifts. And specifically, we use something called inflationary expectations to try and explain shifts in the Phillips curve, and recognizing inflationary expectations allows us to augment or supplement the Phillips curve to take into account the role that inflationary expectations play in not only affecting rates of inflation, but also affecting the unemployment rate. So we did go to some extent through this in class, and so the main point of this video is, like in the previous video, is to show you how we can use aggregate demand and aggregate supply to actually make the link between aggregate demand and aggregate supply and the Phillips curve. Here, the point is to actually show how by incorporating inflationary expectations, we're able to show how the Phillips curve can shift over time. So to do that, and I'll talk through inflationary expectations in more detail as we go through, but I'm going to shift to the document camera. Let's do that. Okay. So what I want to do is, like we did in the previous video, I want to draw on the left hand side an aggregate demand and aggregate supply model diagram. So that's what I'm doing here, if you want to follow and do it with me. Remember, for aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we're measuring real output on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, we're measuring the price level. I draw in a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Aggregate demand is downward sloping because as goods and services become more expensive, fewer of them are demanded, and as goods and services become cheaper, more of them are demanded. I'm drawing in a positively sloped aggregate supply curve. and I am showing the equilibrium at point A, and specifically marking off the price level, which will be PA in equilibrium, as well as the equilibrium level of output, which, like before, I'm going to use the full employment level of output as my equilibrium output. Remember that the full employment level of output and production is the level of output that's achievable if firms in the economy are using their resources to their fullest potential, and that is associated with a certain amount of unemployment. Specifically, the amount of unemployment at the full employment level of output is known as the natural rate of unemployment. Like before, we're going to attach some figures to the unemployment rates that we end up using. So we're going to say that the natural rate of unemployment is 5%. Like before, epsilon, which is the responsiveness of inflation to changes in the unemployment rate, will be equal to 1, just to keep it simple. On the right-hand side, like before, I then draw in the Phillips curve. And remember, the Phillips curve is charting the relationship between unemployment rates. So on the horizontal axis, we're measuring the unemployment rates. And on the vertical axis, we're measuring wage inflation. Okay, and the symbol for wage inflation is usually G, although here we're going to be dealing with inflationary expectations, so you can also use the pi symbol to illustrate inflation here. And the unemployment rate is U. We start by drawing in the short-run Phillips curve, or the simple Phillips curve if you want to call it that, and marking off point A. And if you recall from the last video, point A on the Phillips curve is then corresponding to point A on the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model diagram. So here, let's just call that inflation at point A, and the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, so this is going to be an iterative process because we are going to need to show how in the economy, if we include the effect of inflationary expectations and recognize that people can adapt their view of inflation depending on what the inflation level is that they experience, we're going to be recognizing that that can feed into the inflation process. But the first point of call is to start with an expansion in the demand for goods and services. So we're going to increase the demand for goods and services, and the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right from AD to AD1. Remember that the increase in the demand for goods and services could be because of an expansionary monetary or fiscal policy, or because of boosts to consumer or investor confidence. When the new equilibrium is reached at point B, the price level will be higher than before, so that's PB, and the level of output will also be higher than before, so output increases. As output increases, the unemployment rate falls below the natural rate of unemployment, and like before, we can think about a certain unemployment rate, UB, and that unemployment rate, let's say that it's equal to 3%. Okay. How do we translate point B on the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, where we're looking at the relationship between prices and output, to the Phillips curve, where we're looking at the relationship between inflation and unemployment? Well, when the demand for goods and services increased, the output level increased, which must mean that the unemployment rate declined. So, like before, we can show on the Phillips curve that an increase in the demand for goods and services will result in a movement up the Phillips curve from point A to point B, because the unemployment rate falls below the natural rate of unemployment, and that rise in prices is associated with an increase in inflation. Okay. What is the inflation rate at point B? For now, we're going to assume that we are not dealing with inflationary expectations. I'm going to use the inflationary expectations Phillips curve equation, but for now, assume that inflationary expectations are 0. And then we'll see how that changes when we recognize the role of inflationary expectations. For now, though, to think about how we get from point A to point B using the Phillips curve equation, inflation is equal to inflationary expectations minus epsilon u minus u star. So if we assume for now that inflationary expectations did not play a role or are not factoring into this model, then inflationary expectations are 0. Epsilon is 1. U, specifically this would be UB, is equal to 3%. I assume that over here. The natural rate of unemployment is 5%, and so 0 minus 1 to minus 2 is equal to 2%. So over here, when there is an increase in the demand for goods and services and prices rise and output rises, the unemployment rate falls and inflation increases. And we can see from the equation that inflation increases because of the positive sign on the inflation rate that we calculate. Okay, this basically takes us up to the short-run Phillips curve, or the simple Phillips curve. What we now need to think about is how we can show a shift of the Phillips curve over time. And the way in which we do that is by incorporating inflationary expectations. Let's say that you're living in this economy and you experienced the demand for goods and services, but you didn't expect that increase in the demand for goods and services. And so when prices rose, that was an unexpected change in the price level. And because that change in the price level was unexpected, that caused the unemployment rate to fall below the natural rate of unemployment, and the inflation that was experienced we can show on the Phillips curve as an upward movement from A to B. In the next time period, though, you are going to anticipate some inflation. If in the economy we are experiencing an inflation rate of 2%, then at the very minimum, we would expect that in the next period, inflation should be at least 2%. And that expectation of inflation is known as our inflationary expectation. If we are currently living in a climate where there is inflation, in the future, there's no reason not to assume that inflation won't be at least what it was in the current period. So in the absence of any evidence of expansionary demand or supply-side policies taking place, our best guess about inflation in the future would be that it should be at least 2%. What this then means, though, is that in terms of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, when workers go to their employers and bargain for wage increases, they're not going to say we want a 0 wage increase. At the very minimum, they are going to want a wage increase that is at least equal to the inflation rate that is existing in the economy at that point in time. And in this case, it's 2%. So if employers agree to an inflation-adjusted wage increase of at least 2%, this is going to cause firms' costs of production to rise. If firms' costs of production rise, that will lead to an upward shift in the aggregate supply curve. So here, the aggregate supply curve shifts from AS to AS1. Just so that you can see why the aggregate supply curve shifts up, I'm going to draw at the bottom the aggregate supply curve by itself. We've got aggregate supply here, AS, and this is output, and that is prices. If firms were producing an amount of output, YX, at a price of PX, that would be given their existing costs of production. If their costs of production rise, they would still be able to produce YX, but only if they charged a higher price for it. So when firms' costs of production rise, we show that as an upward or leftward shift of the aggregate supply curve. indicating that whatever the quantity of goods and services is that firms are able to supply, when their costs of production rise, they will supply that quantity of goods and services at a higher price. Okay? So here, the reason why firms' costs of production have increased is because, given the inflation in the economy, people are now bargaining for wage increases at a minimum equal to the inflation rate that they are experiencing. And that inflation rate that they are experiencing is their inflationary expectation. It's the minimum by which they expect inflation rates to rise in the future. And they would want a wage increase to at least cover this inflationary expectation so that the purchasing power of salaries doesn't fall. So we show this bargaining that takes place between employers and employees and the outcomes of that wage bargaining pushing firms' costs of production up as a leftward or upward shift of the aggregate supply curve. And that allows us to reach an equilibrium at, say, point C. And at point C, the price level is higher than before. Of course it is, because firms have passed on the increase in their costs of production to the economy in the form of higher prices. So consumers now pay more for the goods and services which they are purchasing because firms experienced an increase in their costs of production. How do we show point C on the Phillips curve? Well, at point C on the Phillips curve, we're back at the full employment level of production and output and back at the natural rate of unemployment. What is the rate of wage inflation? Well, at a very minimum, the rate of wage inflation is going to be equal to the inflationary expectations that are taking place in this economy. So point C over here, we can then draw it in, and what we are then inadvertently doing is recognizing that over time, because of inflationary expectations, the short-run Phillips curve can shift over time. So point C on this new short-run Phillips curve corresponds to point C on the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Let's think quickly how we go from point B to point C, but using the Phillips curve equation. From point B to point C, we want to work out what the inflation rate is, and it's equal to our inflationary expectations minus epsilon, U minus U star. We know that inflationary expectations were 2%. That was because in the previous period, the demand for goods and services increased, and based upon the numbers that we had assumed in this example, inflation went up by 2%. That 2% change in inflation is then what we used or had to base our inflationary expectations on. So our best guess about inflation for the future was that inflation would at least be 2%. So that's our inflationary expectation. Minus epsilon, which is 1. But now note what happens. This economy is back at the full employment level of production and output. So over here, at point C, what you should note is that the actual rate of unemployment and the natural rate of unemployment coincide. The economy is back to the full employment level of production and output. So here, the actual rate of unemployment is equal to the natural rate of unemployment, so they're both 5%. So this gives us 2% minus 1 multiplied by 0, which gives us 2%. And if we look on the Phillips curve, what it's suggesting then is that the inflation rate at point B and point C are the same. And notice that when we previously calculated the inflation rate, it was 2%. Now we calculate the inflation rate, and it's still 2%. The reason why the inflation rate stays the same is because in this economy, the fact that there are inflationary expectations built into the adjustment process means that the economy can adjust back to the full employment level of production and output, and there is no deviation in the level of output away from the full employment level of output, and the natural rate of unemployment and the actual rate of unemployment once again coincide with each other. So essentially then, shifts in the short-run Phillips curve can be explained by including a measure of inflationary expectations and recognizing that people adapt to the changing inflation rates that they may encounter in the economy. Inflationary expectations means that we experience inflation in the economy and then we adapt and respond to that in terms of how we negotiate with employers for wage increases. And it is this adaptative or adaptive expectations or inflationary expectations that can help us to explain shifts in the short-run Phillips curve that are observed in the data over an extended period of time. The final thing just to talk about, although there is not a separate diagram for this, is the idea of rational expectations. Rational expectations would argue that there is no need for, in the economy, people to first experience the inflation before adapting or changing their expectations and changing their behavior. Rather, the idea with rational expectations is that people are well aware of how inflation will change in the future because they have access to information. They have access to information, for example, from the Reserve Bank, who communicate regularly in South Africa at least once a month about the policies and measures that they are introducing to try and curtail any rises in inflation that might happen. They also know in advance how the government is planning to implement monetary and fiscal policy. So what this means is that people are rational and are able to process the information which they have at their disposal. This would mean that people don't have to first experience an increase in the rate of inflation to then change their expectations. Rather, their expectations adjust immediately once they receive information about expected policy changes from either the Reserve Bank or the government. This idea then means that in terms of our diagram, we would not move from, say, point A to point B to point C. Rather, if people are rational, they know that an increase in the demand for goods and services will increase prices, and that ultimately they will need to bargain for higher wage increases with their employers to avoid a decline in the purchasing power of their salaries. Because in rational expectations then this process is built in, diagrammatically we wouldn't go from point A to point B to point C if we were thinking about inflation in a rational expectations framework. Rather, the adjustment would be instantaneous. We would go from point A directly to point C. People wouldn't have to first experience the rise in prices before adjusting their expectations and then negotiating with employers. They would know that the government is planning, or the Reserve Bank, are planning expansionary policies. They would build that into their inflationary negotiations, their wage negotiations with employers. And as a result, the adjustment from A to C would be immediate. So with rational expectations, diagrammatically, the only difference is that there would be a movement straight from point A to point C. With inflation expectations and the augmented Phillips curve, the idea about how expectations operate is more adaptive. We go from point A to point to point B and then to point C. With rational expectations, it's a more immediate adjustment. Alright, that then marks the end of the video for this particular session, and in future sessions we will see whether or not future videos are possible.